Afternoon, Facebook. Today I'm going to talk on the topic of compulsory voting, which is the system we have in Australia. First, I just want to make a note about the sound. So yesterday I did a video with an external microphone, which seemed to work with my computer, and today, for whatever reason, it wouldn't record sound. I know I've been told on a previous video that using the computer's microphone, the sound wasn't great. So hopefully today's sound is better. But if it isn't any good, I do apologise. Not much I can do about it today. I'll have a look at it tomorrow and see why the microphone wasn't working, and hopefully I can get it fixed. But in the meantime, we'll do the best we can. So I want to talk about compulsory voting in Australia and why it's a bad idea and it should be changed. So in 1901, when the Federation was originally set up, it wasn't a compulsory voting system. Mind you, there was a lot of restrictions. If you were a woman or an Aboriginal, for example, you weren't allowed to vote no matter what. But for the male population, it was completely up to the individual whether they'd vote. And they realised in the 20s and the 30s that when it wasn't a compulsory voting system, that a lot of people just didn't bother. Now, I would argue the reason they didn't bother is because the politicians of the day didn't bother to engage the people, and the people therefore didn't care, so they didn't turn out to vote. I think while that isn't ideal either, that the idea of compelling people to vote in Australia ultimately leads to bad things happening in elections. So there's a few things to consider. Firstly, some people just don't want to vote. It's a huge imposition on their day. They don't want to go to a polling booth on a Saturday. They might have other things that they'd rather do, whether it be sport, family, etc. And I think that's fine. I think if you have to have the choice and you choose not to, I think that's fine. Of course, if you choose not to vote, if we had a non-compulsory system, you also then shouldn't complain about things that are happening in government, and you shouldn't, complain if there was some law brought in that you weren't particularly impressed about. So that's probably the only caveat I'd put on that. If you don't want to vote, you shouldn't have to. The other problem with compulsory voting is there are a whole bunch of idiots out there that show up at every election because they're made to, and they vote. Now, these votes can look like a few different things. So the first one's a donkey vote. They just literally tick one on the first square. There are people who get elected to, especially the Senate, potentially because they just happen to draw number one. And if you don't understand how ballot papers work, it's much like a horse barrier draw. They're just randomly selected in which order they will appear on the ballot. So if you happen to luck out and get position one on the ballot paper, it's possible, if it's a tight margin, that you'll get elected by accident almost because of people doing a donkey vote or an informal vote. When you consider that 5% and this is an average that's stood up over time, on average 5% of the people who vote on any given election do so informally, and that at the last federal election, 44 seats were decided by a margin of less than 5%, there are a lot of seats potentially being decided upon simply because of a donkey vote. So that's a problem with compulsory voting. Another issue I have with compulsory voting is that, generally speaking, a lot of people don't have any education in the policies of the day. Now, that has in part got to do with that the media decide to focus on who's eating onions and what football team someone is following instead of the policies. It's also partly because people aren't engaged. They don't care. The average person probably doesn't really even think about politics. They'd rather watch maths. Not that I've ever watched an episode of it, just say in case you're wondering. And they have no understanding of government, how it works, what the implications are. They might know, if they're lucky, the name of the two leaders. But even that, there's a significant part of the Australian voting public who don't even know who Bill Shorten and ScoMo are. So they're literally going in and casting a vote with no knowledge of what's actually happening at that election. Excuse me, still got the cold. I actually would advocate for a system where It's not compulsory voting, but also beyond that, you have to actually have some idea. You have to pass, and I don't know how you put this test together, but I think it would be a good idea for people to pass at least a basic political test. At least know the difference between Labor and Liberals, who the leaders are, the importance of, what you're voting for, some of the issues that might be around any particular election. But maybe that's a little step too far, but that's my personal preference. I think having to pass a basic knowledge test on politics isn't such a bad idea. But going back to compulsory voting, I think in general we need to just get to the point where we can decide to trust Australians to decide whether they think it's important for themselves to vote or not. This is also part of the larger problem that I see in society, where certain elements of the government, especially on the left of politics, although maybe some elements of the right, feel like the average person hasn't got the ability or intelligence to decide for themselves what they should do. Now, we see this in a lot of areas, but again, in the voting thing, we see it, in the form of compulsory voting. The government is basically saying that if we leave it up to the people, they'll make the wrong choice. And now, I don't know how you could argue one way or the other that being true, but I think it just is a symptom of a greater problem. Going down a bit of a tangent there on that point. However, as I said, compulsory voting doesn't lead to good decisions, in my opinion, in our system. It just leads to the potential of someone being elected into a seat or into a Senate position simply because a whole bunch of people haven't got a choice, and if they don't vote, they'll get fined. Be really interested in your thoughts. If you want to jump in the comment section and let me know, I'm going to post this on YouTube as well. I'd be really interested to know if you think the compulsory voting system is a good idea or a bad idea. All right, thanks. Talk to you tomorrow.